In this video, I'm going to try to briefly explain to you a couple of vocabulary words that are really important for you to make sure you understand as you work through this course. I'll briefly discuss what is data. We'll take a look at what is a population versus a sample. I'll go over quickly the difference between quantitative versus qualitative data and whether or not the qualitative data is discrete or continuous. I'll also mention real briefly the difference between an observational study versus an experiment. And then there are lots of different types of samples that you can gather, but we'll discuss real briefly convenience sampling. I'm going to use an overly simplified example here just so that I can explain some of the important vocabulary words that you want to make sure you understand to be successful in this course. So in statistics, our goal is to try to understand what's happening in the population. So let's just suppose that you did some research, and in your research, you found out that there is this exercise regimen that increases an athlete's agility level. So let's call this exercise regimen Power X, okay? So it turns out that if athletes follow this exercise regimen, it will increase their agility level. And so you go, I want to test this out. So when you are trying to test this out, you are doing what's called an experiment. So this would be an example of an experimental study or an experiment, not an observational study. So the difference between an experiment versus an observational study is that in an experiment, you actually are trying to test out some tool, or you're doing some type of intervention, and you want to see if that tool or that intervention, so here that intervention is Power X, you want to see if it has any effect. And here we're trying to see if it affects an athlete's agility level. So that's an experiment. Another example of an experiment would be if you wanted to test out a drug. You wanted to see if a particular drug maybe helps someone sleep better. So you would have an experiment where you'd have two groups. One group takes the drug, the other group is given a placebo. In this experiment, you would probably, what you would do is you would test the athlete's agility level before they do the exercise regimen, and then you would also then measure their agility level after they do the exercise regimen. Okay, so an observational study would be a study where you collect data and you're just observing to see what the data shows. So you're not actually trying to see, you're not implementing anything or experimenting on any tool to see if there's an effect. So that would be an observational study. Okay, so again, here we want to know if this exercise regimen increases the agility level, and you're interested specifically in lacrosse players. So if we're talking about the population in this example would be all college lacrosse players. Okay. All right, so that is the population. But when you're doing a study, it's very rare that you're able to collect data from the entire population. So due to time constraint and financial constraints, I'm not going to be able to get every single college lacrosse player in the United States to participate in my experiment. So what can I do instead? I'm still interested in trying to understand what's happening to all college lacrosse players, but my best efforts lead me to be able to just study from a sample. So a sample is a subset from the population. So I can't collect data from every single college lacrosse player, but maybe I'm able to collect data from JU lacrosse players. Okay, so JU lacrosse players, they are a subset of the population. So I gather data from maybe just a subset. So I don't know how many lacrosse players there are in the entire United States. So let's be more specific here in the US. But let's say from JU, I'm able to get 50 lacrosse players to participate in my study. Okay, and so I'm going to start collecting a lot of data from my sample to try to test their agility level. So would you agree with me that even if every single JU lacrosse player participated in this exercise regimen, right, their agility level is going to be affected by other factors, right? So maybe it increases their agility level, but there are other factors and other variables that affect your agility level, not just this exercise regimen. So you want to collect more data. So now let's talk about the type of data that we might be interested in collecting in this particular experiment. So then you start asking yourself, well, what are some other variables? So now I'm using the word variables. So I'm going to start listing those variables in these columns. All right, so what are some other variables that could affect one's agility level aside from an exercise regimen called Power X? So maybe gender plays a role. So could gender be a factor? Maybe our height. Okay, and let's measure height in inches. Maybe one's weight. Let's measure that in pounds. What about your ethnic background? Okay, how about your college level at the time that we do this study? How about the average amount of sleep? Um, so average sleep per week. Does that play a role? And these are just some variables, but I'm sure you can think of some others. So let's just pretend that our first participant is male, 75 inches tall, weighs 180, is Caucasian, so we identify that as C, is a freshman, so we identify that as F, and let's say 49 hours, okay? Participant 2 is female, 66 inches, maybe 130 pounds, also Caucasian, sophomore, so we identify that as SO, and 42 hours. Let's say this person is male, 71 inches, 175 pounds, or let's say this person is 175.28. Hispanic, senior, and doesn't get that much sleep per week, so 35 hours. And of course, we could keep going to participant number 050, okay? All right, so I want us to take a look at the variables and the type of data that we collected. So there are two types of data that you can collect. So data can be qualitative, and qualitative is also sometimes called categorical data. So qualitative or categorical data are data that represent some category. So if we take a look at the variables that we collected here, I'll highlight it in red. Gender would be considered categorical or numerical, or qualitative. Ethnic would be categorical, and college level would be categorical. Okay. The other type of data that you can collect is what's called quantitative. So quantitative. And quantitative is also considered sometimes called numerical data. All right. So I will highlight that in green. So obviously height would be numerical or quantitative, weight, and average amount of sleep. Okay. Now, when we talk about quantitative data can be broken down into two more categories. There is discrete numerical data, and then there is continuous numerical data. Okay, so what is the difference between discrete and continuous? Continuous numerical data is data where when you collect data that is numerical, you can list the responses from your participants on a number line that is continuous. So an example of that would be height and weight. So if I collect data about someone's height, someone could be 66 inches, but they could also be maybe 66.12 inches, or they could be 71.58 inches, all right? And I can get participants who will list their height anywhere on this number line, and it's a continuous number line. So the same thing can be said for weight. So height and weight, we would say, are continuous numerical data. Okay, and if we talk about average number of sleep would also be continuous numerical data, because even though I've listed whole numbers here, 49, 42, 35, someone could say that maybe they get a lot of sleep, 50.15 hours of sleep per week. Okay, so then what would be an example of data that's discrete? Now, I haven't listed an example here, but discrete means it is data that's numerical, but it doesn't have to be on a number line. Instead, it is just a counting number. So in this particular example, let's say that we measure agility. So let me go back up here. Let's say that we measure agility on a scale where it is 0. So actually not a scale. So let's say that we identify it as 0, 1, 2, 3, or 5, where we define what each number stands for. So 0 is very low, and let's say 5 is very high. Okay, so low agility level, high agility level, and we categorize it as either 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. So that would be an example of something that's discrete because it's a counting number. We don't have 1.5 or 2.5, etc. And another example would be if I were to ask you, how many credit hours have you completed? So maybe number of credits completed. So because we complete credits as whole numbers, all right, maybe this person who's a freshman hasn't completed any yet. Maybe a sophomore has completed 60 credit hours, a senior has completed 120. So we don't complete half credits. So that would be another example of something that's discrete. And the last thing that I want to mention, which I forgot to mention earlier, is when we get a sample where we use just JU lacrosse players, this would be an example of convenience sampling. It's convenient because it's easy for us to access JU lacrosse players if we were doing this study because we are at JU. And the data that we collect from them in this particular moment in time, this is data that is a cross section because we're looking at their height, their weight, etc., at a particular moment in time.